Welcome to my channel. My name is Sofia Harper, and today I am telling you a story I never thought I would speak out loud, not because it is dramatic or shocking, but because it lived quietly inside me for years like a breath held too long. This is not a story about revenge. It is a story about erasure and survival and the strange moment when truth walks back into a room that buried it. I was born in a small town where everyone knew each other, where names traveled faster than facts and reputation mattered more than reality. My mother was admired, respected, admired again, the kind of woman people trusted instantly. She baked for church, volunteered at school, and spoke with a calm authority that made adults listen and children behave. I was her only daughter. And for a long time I believed that meant something. I believed it meant protection and love and belonging, but what it actually meant was possession. My mother did not see me as a person, she saw me as an extension of herself, a reflection that needed to stay clean and predictable and impressive at all times. I learned early that my feelings were inconvenient and my questions were dangerous. I learned that obedience earned silence and silence passed for peace. My father left when I was 9, quietly, no drama, just absence, and from that moment on my mother became the center of everything, the rule maker, the judge, the narrator of our lives. And in her version of the story, I was always one wrong step away from disgrace. I was not a bad child. I did well in school, stayed out of trouble, kept my head down, but I had one unforgivable flaw. I wanted to leave. I wanted a life that was not mapped out in advance. I wanted to study music and literature. I wanted noise and movement and cities where no one knew my name. And when I tried to tell her this, she laughed, not kindly, not cruelly, just dismissively, and said, "You will grow out of it." But I did not grow out of it. I grew into it. The older I got, the more the house felt like it was shrinking, the walls closing and the air getting thinner. By the time I was 19, I was barely breathing. I applied to universities in secret, filled out forms late at night, printed essays at the library, hid envelopes in my backpack, and when the acceptance letter came, it felt like oxygen, real, full, life-giving oxygen. I told my mother the next morning, and I will never forget the way her face changed. Not anger, not sadness, something colder, calculation. She asked where the university was. I told her. She nodded slowly and said, "Absolutely not." And that was it. No discussion, no questions, no curiosity, just no. I said I was going anyway. I said I had scholarships. I said I could work. She said, "If you walk out that door, do not come back." And I thought she was bluffing because mothers are not supposed to mean that, but she did mean it. I left 2 weeks later with a single suitcase and a borrowed car, and I did not look back because I was afraid if I did I would stay. The first year was hard. Harder than I expected. I worked 2 jobs, studied at night, lived in shared apartments, ate cheap food, but every morning I woke up knowing the day belonged to me, and that feeling carried me through. I called home, at first left messages, sent emails, none were returned. Eventually I stopped trying, not because I stopped caring, but because I needed to survive, and survival takes focus. Years passed quietly. I built a life piece by piece. I graduated, moved to another city, published essays, taught part-time, found friends who knew me without history, who did not need me to perform, and still there was a hole where a family should have been. I never told people much about my mother. I just said we were not close. It was easier than explaining the truth, because the truth sounded unbelievable. Who tells the world their child is dead? I did not know she had done that at first. I only learned much later from a stranger at a cafe in my hometown. When I returned briefly for a conference, she looked at me too long, squinted, and said, "You look just like Martha Harper, daughter." And I smiled politely and said, "Yes." She paused, then said, "Oh my God, you are alive." And my stomach dropped. She covered her mouth, said, "I am so sorry. We all thought you died years ago. Accident overseas." Your mother said it was too painful to talk about. And just like that, my entire past rearranged itself. My mother had not just cut me off, she had erased me. She had rewritten reality so completely that my absence became a tragedy instead of a choice. She mourned me publicly, held my memory like proof of her strength while I was out there breathing and living and loving. I did not confront her. I did not call or write. Something in me went very still, very calm, because I understood something fundamental. She had killed me socially so she could remain blameless and powerful, and that kind of lie does not crack easily. I left town the next day and told no one what I had learned, but the truth has a way of circling back even when you do nothing. Years later, I received an email from an unknown address, subject funeral arrangements, and for a moment I thought it was spam. Then I opened it and read the name Martha Harper. My mother had died, suddenly, stroke, no warning. The email explained that as next of kin arrangements were underway and that extended family and community members would be informed, and I sat there staring at the Screen feeling nothing, not grief, not anger, just a deep, quiet curiosity, because a question rose up inside me that I could not ignore. What happens when the dead return to bury the liar? I did not reply immediately. I booked a flight instead, packed a black dress, and flew back to the town that had buried me alive. The day of the funeral, the church was full, flowers, hymns, familiar faces, aged but unchanged, and at the front a framed photo of my mother, smiling, serene, beloved, and beneath it a smaller, empty space, where a photo of me might have been if I had remained dead. I sat in the back, unnoticed, listening as people spoke of her strength, her loss, her courage. As a single mother who endured tragedy with grace, they spoke of me as if I were a ghost, as if my absence were sacred, as if my silence were proof of my demise. And with every word, something inside me hardened, not into bitterness, but into resolve, because I realized that silence was no longer survival. Silence was complicity. And when the pastor asked if anyone wished to speak, my legs moved before my fear could stop them. I stood, turned, and walked down the aisle toward the front of the church, and the sound that followed was not gasps or cries, it was confusion, chairs shifting, whispers rippling, recognition dawning too late. And when I reached the podium, I looked out at a room full of people who thought they knew my story and said, "My name is Sofia Harper, and I am not dead." The silence that followed felt like a physical thing, heavy, pressing against every chest in the room. I could hear someone drop a program, I could hear breathing, I could hear my own heartbeat, loud, steady, real. And for the first time in years, I did not feel small. I did not feel like I was trespassing in my own history. I stood there, alive, undeniable, and I did not rush my words, because truth does not need speed, it needs space. I told them I was her daughter. I told them I had not died in an accident overseas. I had not died at all. I told them I had lived, studied, worked, failed, succeeded, loved. I told them that I had left because staying meant disappearing in a different way. And as I spoke, faces shifted, some with shock, some with guilt, some with relief, because a mystery had been solved. I did not accuse, I did not raise my voice, I simply narrated my existence, and that was enough, because the lie depended on my absence. And here I was, present, whole, breathing. The pastor stepped back, unsure what to do. And I continued, because no one stopped me. I spoke of the last time I saw my mother, of the door closing behind me, of the years of silence, and then I spoke of the moment in the cafe when I learned I had been declared dead, and that was when the room truly changed, because death is one thing, but choosing it for someone else, that is different. I could see the questions forming in their eyes, the recalculations, memories being revisited, conversations suddenly sour, and I realized something quietly powerful. My mother was no longer there to control the narrative, and without her voice the story had no anchor except me. I finished by saying, "This is not a correction, this is not anger, this is simply the truth." And I stepped away from the podium and sat back down. My hands were steady, I felt light, almost buoyant, and the service continued, awkwardly disjointed, like a play that had lost its script. People avoided my eyes at first, then gradually, one by one, they turned heads. Curiosity overcame discomfort. After the final hymn, no one rushed the exit the way they usually do. Instead, there was a hovering, a collective uncertainty, and then it began. An older woman approached me, eyes wet, said, "I held a candle for you every year. I whispered prayers for your soul." And I said thank you, and meant it, because her grief had been real, even if it was misplaced. A man I barely remembered from childhood said, "Your mother told us it broke her every day." And I said, "I am sure it did, but she chose that break." Others asked why I had not reached out, why I let them believe it, and I answered honestly, because I did not know, because I was surviving, because sometimes silence is the only way forward, and not everyone accepted that. Some faces hardened, some people walked away, unwilling to let go of the version they had carried for years. I understood that two lies offer comfort, truth demands adjustment. After the church emptied, I stood alone near the coffin, looking at the woman who raised me, who erased me, and I felt a complicated grief, not for who she was, but for who she could not be. I did not touch the coffin, I did not say goodbye aloud. There was nothing left to say. I left the church and stepped into cold air, bright, sharp, and for the first time since returning I felt free, not because I had spoken, but because I had been heard. In the days that followed, the town shifted subtly. Conversations buzzed, phone calls were made, stories were compared. Some people reached out with apologies, others with questions, others with defensiveness. My aunts, my uncles, neighbors, former teachers. Each interaction peeled back another layer of the lie, and with each one the weight lifted from my chest. My mother had controlled information the way others control money or affection, and without her presence the system collapsed quickly. It turns out lies require constant maintenance. Truth does not, it just waits. I Stayed in town longer than planned, met people for coffee, listened more than I spoke, answered what I could, and declined what I did not. Owe closure to everyone. Some nights I lay awake replaying moments, wondering if I should have confronted her earlier, if any of this could have been different, but those questions led nowhere because they assumed she would have chosen differently, and the truth is she never had. I visited my childhood home one afternoon, stood on the sidewalk, and looked at the windows where I once watched the world and dreamed of leaving. A neighbor came out, startled, smiled awkwardly, said, "We thought you were gone," and I smiled back and said I was, but not the way you think. I did not go inside. I did not need to. The house no longer held me, the town no longer defined me, and the story no longer owned me. I booked my return flight with a sense of completion, not because everything was resolved, but because it no longer needed to be, and as the plane lifted I felt something settle into place. A truth finally aligned with the world, and I knew this was not an ending, it was a passage, and somewhere ahead there was more to say, more to understand, more to become. When I returned to my life, the one I had built quietly without witnesses, something had changed inside me in a way that surprised even me. I had expected grief to arrive late, like a storm delayed, but instead what came was clarity, sharp, clean, almost gentle. I walked through my days lighter, my shoulders no longer braced for a judgment that was not coming, because the town had spoken and the lie had lost its power. People knew now, and knowing changed everything, not dramatically, not loudly, but permanently. Emails arrived from distant relatives, apologies, questions, invitations. Some I answered, some I did not, because healing is not a group project, and I was not obligated to soothe everyone who felt uncomfortable with the truth. I focused instead on the small solid things: my work, my students, my friends, the rituals that made up my real life. And yet, even in that forward motion, the past continued to echo, especially when my phone rang one evening, and I saw a number I had not seen in years. My Aunt Claire, my mother's sister, the one who had stayed silent, the one who had nodded along when my name was spoken like a memorial. She asked if we could talk, and something in her voice was different, stripped of certainty, and when we met, she cried, immediately said she was sorry, said she had believed my mother, because it was easier than questioning her, and I listened, because listening no longer cost me anything, and then she told me something that reframed everything. She said, "Your mother did not just say you died," she said. "You chose to." She said you were ashamed and did not want anyone to look for you. She said you asked her to keep it quiet for her own peace, and hearing that I understood the final cruelty of it. My mother had not just erased me, she had used my imagined consent as her shield. She had made my silence look like preference, and that realization hurt more than the lie itself, because it meant she had known on some level that the truth would not hold. She had needed my death to look voluntary, to protect her image as the abandoned mother, and that image had been more important than my existence. I did not tell Claire everything. She did not need to carry all of it, but I told her enough, and when we parted she hugged me and said, "I am glad you lived," and I believed her. Weeks passed, and the world moved on as it does, but then something unexpected happened. An invitation arrived, handwritten, careful, from the town council, asking if I would consider speaking at a community event about identity and truth and the power of narrative. And at first I laughed at the irony, but then I considered it, because for so long my voice had been missing from that place, and perhaps this was a way to return without shrinking myself. So I accepted, not out of obligation, but out of choice. And when I stood in that familiar hall weeks later, microphone warm, lights bright, I spoke not about my mother, but about myself, about what it means to be defined without your consent, about the quiet damage of unchecked authority and the resilience of a life reclaimed. I did not name names, I did not accuse, I simply told my story as mine, and when I finished the applause was real, not polite, not pitying, and afterward people lined up not to question, but to thank me for saying what they had never had language for. And in that moment I felt something like closure, not the cinematic kind, not the clean ending kind, but the lived kind, the kind that lets you sleep without rehearsing conversations that will never happen. I thought often about my mother in those days, not with longing, but with curiosity. I wondered if she had believed her own story, if she had convinced herself that I was better off dead than disobedient, and that question led me to a realization that settled deeply. She had needed control more than connection, and control had always required my disappearance, and I could not change that, but I could choose what came next. Months later, as winter turned to spring, I visited the cemetery alone, no audience, no announcement, just me standing in front of a name etched in stone with dates that did not include mine. I did not feel anger or forgiveness, I felt understanding, and that understanding was enough. I left flowers, not for her, but for the girl I had been, the one who had left with a suitcase and a borrowed car. Believing freedom was selfish, and as I walked away, I knew something fundamental had shifted. The story no longer needed defending. The truth had done its work, and now it was time to live forward fully unburdened and open, ready for whatever came next. After that visit to the cemetery, life did not suddenly become perfect or poetic, but it became honest in a way it never had before, and honesty has a strange warmth to it, like standing in sunlight after years indoors. I returned fully to my work, teaching, writing, guiding young voices who were still learning how to tell their own stories, and I noticed something different in myself. I no longer flinched when they wrote about family or loss or betrayal. I no longer softened my feedback to protect an old wound, because that wound was no longer open. It had scarred, and scars do not ache the way fresh cuts do. They simply exist, reminders of survival, not damage. My days filled with routine again, but the routine felt earned. Mornings with coffee, afternoons with lectures, evenings with quiet walks, and sometimes late nights writing, not because I was running from something, but because I finally had something to say. Friends noticed the shift before I did. They said I laughed more freely, stood taller, spoke without apology, and they were right. Something fundamental had rearranged inside me. The part of me that once waited for permission had gone silent, and in its place was a steady certainty that I belonged exactly where I stood. I began receiving messages from people I had never met, viewers, readers, strangers who had heard about the funeral moment through word of mouth or local news, or someone who had been in the room that day. They told me pieces of their own stories: daughters cut off, sons erased, siblings rewritten, and each message reinforced something I had only begun to understand. Truth is not just personal, it is contagious. When spoken, it gives others permission to breathe, and that realization carried weight, because it meant my story was no longer just mine. It was part of a larger human pattern, one where silence protects harm and voice disrupts it. I did not become an activist or a speaker full-time. I did not chase attention. I simply stayed open and available, and that was enough. Months later, I received a final letter forwarded from the estate lawyer. It was something my mother had written years earlier, sealed and dated, with instructions to be opened only if certain conditions were met, one of them being confirmation of my death. And reading that line made me smile softly, because even in planning she had anticipated the permanence of her lie. I almost did not open it, but curiosity won. The letter was brief, restrained, carefully worded. She wrote that she hoped I was at peace wherever I was, that she had done what she believed was necessary, that the world could be cruel to those who strayed, and that she prayed I had found forgiveness. Reading it, I felt no anger, no urge to respond, no need to correct her even now, because I finally understood something she never would. She had lived her entire life fearing judgment, while I had learned to live without it, and that difference mattered more than any confrontation. I folded the letter, placed it back in the envelope, and set it aside, not as a relic of pain, but as evidence of a life lived from fear rather than truth. And then I went on with my day. The seasons changed again and again, and with each passing month the story lost its sharpness, not its meaning, but its sting. It became something I carried rather than something that carried me. In one evening, as I sat at my desk preparing notes for a lecture on narrative identity, I paused, because I realized I was no longer teaching from theory. I was teaching from lived experience, and that realization felt grounding, empowering, complete. I thought about the young version of myself, 19 years old, suitcase in hand, heart racing, terrified, but determined, and I wished I could tell her that she would survive, not just survive, but thrive, that one day she would stand in a room full of people who thought she was gone and say her name out loud without shaking, and that the world would make space for her, because the world always makes space for truth eventually. You just have to be willing to walk into it. I did not rebuild a relationship with my mother. She was gone, and that door was closed, but I did rebuild my relationship with myself, and that turned out to be the one that mattered most. I stopped apologizing for leaving, stopped justifying my choices, stopped carrying the imagined disappointment of someone who could not see me, and in doing so, I felt lighter, freer, more present in my own life. There were moments of sadness, of course. Grief does not disappear, it changes shape, but it no longer defined me. It sat quietly in the background, like a shadow at dusk, present, but not overwhelming. And then one quiet morning, as I prepared to record the story to share it with you, I realized something else. The story had never been about death. It had been about voice, about the danger of letting someone else speak your truth, and the power of reclaiming it, even when it feels too late, especially when it feels too late, because it never is. The truth does not expire. It waits patiently for courage, and when courage arrives, even years later, it Opens doors you thought were sealed forever. And now, as I come to the end of this story, I want to say this: if you are listening and you feel unseen, erased, silenced, or rewritten by someone who benefits from your quiet, I want you to know you are not alone and you are not wrong for choosing yourself. Your life does not need permission to exist. Your voice does not need consensus to be real. Speak when you are ready, not when others are comfortable. And remember, silence can protect you for a time, but truth will free you forever. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for holding space for it. If it resonated with you, if it reminded you of your own journey, your own boundaries, your own becoming, please share it with someone who needs it. And if you want to hear more stories like this, more honest human stories about loss, resilience, and finding your way back to yourself, subscribe to this channel and stay with me. My name is Sofia Harper, and this was my story. Thank you for being here, and I will see you next time.